Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Naomi Reinhartz. I'm the Chief Development Officer of the America-Israel Friendship League. I'm calling in today from Boston, and I want to welcome everyone who's watching this webinar on Zoom and on Facebook Live from the United States, from Israel, and from around the world. We are delighted to have you here for another wonderful discussion between Americans and Israelis, like we like to have every Sunday and Wednesday. And I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Deborah Harris, who is a top literary agent calling in today from Israel. And we have Yaniv Iczkovits, who's calling in also from Israel, who's one of her authors and a premier author of this wonderful book that I just finished called The Slaughterman's Daughter, who will be talking about that book and his other writings today. And I'm also delighted to introduce you to Jane Weitzman, who is the president of the Jewish Book Council and a big fan of Israeli literature, like all of us. Let me turn it over to Jane before we start the discussion.
Thank you, Naomi. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jane Weitzman, as Naomi said, president of the Jewish Book Council, and I'm really honored to be with you today. Jewish Book Council is very proud to partner with the American Israel Friendship League and highlight some of the incredible work and ideas coming out of the Israeli literary community. For those of you unfamiliar with the Jewish Book Council, our mission is to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature, from public programs such as this one, awards and conferences, to our literary journal, Paper Brigade, essays by Jewish authors, book club resources, interviews, and reading lists. JBC provides tools for substantive conversations about Jewish life and identity. I encourage you to join the conversation and find out more at jewishbookcouncil.org. In today's conversation, we will have the chance to hear from Israel's premier literary agent, Deborah Harris of Deborah Harris Agency, who was also Jewish Book Council's most recent recipient of our Mentorship Award as part of the National Jewish Book Awards for her incredible impact to the field throughout her career. Deborah will also be joined by Yaniv Iczkovits, author of the brilliant and recently translated novel, The Slaughterman's Daughter, and one of Deborah's authors. I'm looking forward to a conversation in which we will gain insight into the world of Israeli letters from each of their perspectives, along with a deeper understanding of both of their unique and important contributions to the field. And now I'm pleased to turn the stage over to Naomi Reinhartz, Chief Development Officer for AIFL, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I just want to let people know we already have people calling in from literally around the world. We have people in South Carolina and Philadelphia and Michigan. We have our regular viewer, Carlo from Kuwait, Calgary, Canada, Phoenix, Arizona. And we already have people remarking in the chat that they are reading the book or they just finished the book, The Slaughterman's Daughter, and they love it, of course. So we'll get more into the book a little bit later on in the discussion. But let me start with Deborah and tell us a little bit about your career. How did you become a literary agent? How did you know that that is what you wanted to do with your career, and when did that start for you?
When I started, my whole life, when I was a kid, I said I wanted to be a publisher. I wanted to publish books. It probably has to do with the fact that I grew up in a very religious, Shabbos-observing house, and all I did on Shabbat was read books. And it led me to, I must have known from a very young age that I was not gifted enough to write. So I thought, I'll publish, I'll agent, I didn't know. But when I came to Israel, I started a really interesting publishing house with several people. And it was very current, and I thought I was bringing everything I knew from working in publishing. In America, I thought I'm going to teach Israel how to publish books. And I was 23 years old, and I didn't know all that much. but I did know what I was looking for. And soon after the 82 war, the first Lebanon war broke out, and I was watching a specific correspondent on Israeli television, and I thought this guy should write a book, and I want to publish this book. And it led me to traveling up north on the third day of the war. And I kept going north and north and north, and I finally hit the Beirut-Damascus highway, and no one was stopping me. And I kept saying, I'm going to meet Ehud Ya'ari, this correspondent that I wanted to write this book. And then I was arrested by the IDF, and they escorted me out of Lebanon, and I understood them. And I went home, and 3 days later, I get a call from Ehud Ya'ari saying, I hear you're looking for me. And it was my dream come true. It was the author that I wanted to speak to. And he said, I already have a publisher, but I need an agent. I said, I'm not an agent. And he said, well, if you reach the Beirut-Damascus highway, you're an agent, and I want to work with you. And I sold the book to Simon & Schuster, and it was the definitive work on the Lebanon War. And that was my first book, and that was the beginning of my career. And I thought I was one thing, but I was really something else. And there are a lot of people in Israel that know how to publish books, but there was no one in Israel at the time that was using the tremendous amount of talent that was in Israel and taking it outside of Israel. And I realized that that was what I was meant to do, and that's how I became an agent.
I haven't heard that story yet before of how someone became an agent. So that's the first for me, at least. I don't know about everyone else watching, but very interesting. What were some of the sort of trends in the Israeli literature market at the time? What kinds of books were being published and being discussed in that period?
Well, when I moved here, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was just published, and that was #1. And Cervantes was published, and the great classics of Russian and French literature. And I thought I arrived to like a place of my dreams. Who wouldn't want to be in a country where Canterbury Tales was #1? Things have changed since then. And Yaniv and I will talk about it. But our bestseller list now looks like everybody else's bestseller list, with stars of Israeli fiction, which is so brilliant, and it takes so hard to get it out into the world. But the bestseller list has changed radically in 40 years. But Yaniv and I will talk about it. We may not even agree about that bestsellers list.
So speaking of Yaniv, what led you to Yaniv? What sort of drew you to his work? What was it about his style or his themes that interested you?
I have our editorial director, Hadar Makov, read the book, and she ruined it. She said, you're going to love it so much. And I wanted to discover it on my own, but she discovered it before me. It resonated so much with the greatest Yiddish writers. And yet it was completely new because there was this Fanny character, which it was the old and the new. And Fanny had never been written about before. And until you've all read about Fanny and discovered who she is, the reviews keep saying it's Kill Bill meets, Agnon and Shalom Aleichem, but it's true. And Fanny is just a character that is so modern and yet is so Jewish and so old world. And what we always look for is something, it's a new voice, and it's really hard to find a new voice, but Yaniv really did it with Slaughterman's daughter. It was the old and the new and the unimaginable.
That's wonderful. Can you talk a little bit before we turn it over to Yaniv? Can you discuss, how some of those earlier trends you discussed and themes in Israeli literature have evolved over time during the course of your career? What have you seen change in Israeli literature and emerge?
Oh, wow. I think that 20, 30 years ago, there were many more people dealing with the political situation. I think fiction in many ways was braver. Writers dealt with how Israelis saw and experienced politics and the occupation and what was going on here. In the last couple of years, I think that what writers, according to the National Library's latest information, 90% of fiction, of Israeli fiction, is dealing with family relations, family dynamics. It's somehow the political context is disappearing because it's not exactly a selling point. And I think life has become much more interior. The writing has become much more interior and less, or extremely imaginative, and less about the political context.
Why would that be? Because Israel is always going to be politicized and always has, internal and external conflicts that people are very much tuned into.
I think that the political situation is too hard to deal with. I think that authors know in advance that people don't really want to read about it. What's happened in Israeli publishing is our agency both represents Israeli writers and some Palestinian writers, and we represent their rights abroad. We work with we work with 75 languages. We also represent from abroad into Israel. And we represent Nobel Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, and what we're selling now. And it reflects every other country's interests. But what we're selling is romantic literature. We're selling commercial popular literature. And if in 1980, 79, 80, Cervantes and Don Quixote and the Canterbury Tales were at the top of the bestsellers list, now the bestsellers list in Israel looks like every other country's bestsellers list. There's no difference. It was once extremely different. Israeli reading was very highbrow, very, very highbrow, academic, intellectually driven. And now it's entertainment. So there are two parts of the bestsellers list, and the bestsellers list sadly doesn't even exist anymore because nobody can agree what would be on the bestsellers list. But it is a combination of really good Israeli literature and very, very popular commercial translated literature. We cannot sell serious nonfiction, science, psychology, political books from the world. The 90% of what we can sell in Israel is extremely popular, commercial, romantic books, and that's what's on the bestsellers list, along with the stars of Israeli literature, for whom there will always be an audience.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that Israeli literature has come to mirror the literature coming from other countries?
I don't want to say it. I can't admit it, but I think it's true.
It's okay.
It's very, very hard for me to look at what we represent and cannot sell.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I understand that many people, my vision of what literature should be is not everybody else's. People want to read to escape and to enjoy and to imagine another life. And that's what we're selling.
Yeah. You have to sell to the audience that you have. And you mentioned 75 languages. How many countries is that? And how have also the foreign rights trends sort of changed during your career with other countries?
We began mostly selling serious literature. Serious, well, there have been several real high points. Selling Batya Gur, who was Israel's first detective writer, and creating this protagonist, Michael Hoayon, who then became known in 20, 30 languages. That was fantastic. That was amazing. And HarperCollins has just reissued all of the Batya Gur library. What we're interested in is not just a book. We want to grow with a writer. We want to build a writer. We want to build that person's career. We were the first agents for Yuval Noah Harari. Representing Sapiens was an extreme honor, joy. I have no words. It was amazing. And that was how I learned what it is to deal with 75 languages. I had David Grossman. We've sold to 45, 50 languages, but to reach 75 languages, it's now how I know India has 10 languages. There you are. You sell to India, that's 10 languages.
Got it covered.
But Sapiens has been on the New York Times bestsellers list now for up to 147 weeks.
Wow.
And it's been extraordinary to have a library, to have copies of books in languages, to work with Indonesia, to work with India, to work with languages that I never was able to work with before. It is a great, great honor.
Yeah.
So it also opened our mind to the fact that there are nonfiction titles here. People who are working in academia, people who are working on subjects that interest the whole world. So we now work a lot more with nonfiction. We always worked with nonfiction, but my heart is with fiction, and that was kind of where we always went. But I learned so much about representing Sapiens.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I myself am a big fan of Sapiens, as are almost everyone I know who's read the book.
Right.
And we have someone in the chat writing that they love also Batya Gur, and other people. Other people are sharing which Israeli authors are their favorites. So speaking of helping and working with someone throughout their career, let's turn it over to Yaniv. Yaniv, maybe you could share with us as well how your career started as an author and what made you want to become an author in the first place.
Wow. First, I have to say about Deborah that she crosses borders up till this day. I mean, this story about 82 is true also because if she believes in someone, she will, put up to a lot of effort to make it happen, and I really appreciate it. And her impact on Hebrew literature and writers is immense. I tell you, I tell you this almost every day, Deborah, so it's important everyone else knows. Well, I never thought I'd become a writer, you know. I always say that there are two kinds of authors. There are those like Amos Oz. When you read his biography, you see that he will most probably become a writer. I mean, Agnon was just across the street, and his father was a professor of literature and worked in the National Library. So the whole setting of his life were kind of, going towards being a writer. I grew up in Rishon LeZion. I don't know if many people know this city, but I can tell you that there aren't many writers that come from Rishon LeZion. It's a suburban city, just 20 minutes off Tel Aviv, but like a whole different planet. So I really thought about studying something useful, you know, law maybe, or math or something like that. But then came the army, and something that you have to realize about Israeli society, I think, is that for some people, the army service is extremely meaningful, and it's absolutely defining, because we go there, there's a mandatory service, and we're just 18, and some of the times we are just being told what to do. You know, we don't choose where to go. It's not like you choose the unit, or you're just being placed at a certain unit. And after 3 or 4 years, which are pretty much intense, you know, there's a lot of emotional gaps to be filled, because you cannot talk about it in this period, and you can't vent. And when I was released from the army after 4 years, I felt like I need to process and understand where was I at this time. So I had my parents had a little shed in their house with all sorts of junk, you know, and stuff. And I just went in there, locked the door, and started writing. And this was the first time at the age of 22 that I even tried to write something. So this is basically my story, which is interesting because it also involves a war. And Deborah's story is also, related to the Lebanon war. So I guess it says a lot about Israeli society and literature.
That's true. That's true. And what was your sort of focus at the time in your writing? What did you like to write about, and has that evolved throughout your career?
Well, I think that the beginning of my career, I was extremely influenced by my favorite authors back then, and some of them also now, like Meir Shalev and David Grossman and Amos Oz. And as Deborah said, in the 80s and the 90s, the Israeli novel, everyone tried to write the big Israeli novel. I don't know who to compare it in the US, but maybe Jonathan Franzen, maybe, you know, the Jonathan Safran Foer, the attempt to write a 500, 600 page novel that has the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all the, you know, so we had writers like Grossman and Meir Shalev and Yoshua Knaz and Yaakov Shabtai. So I was extremely influenced by these writers, and I think that at the beginning I just tried to imitate them without being noticed, without being caught. And when it didn't work, I realized that I have to find my own voice, which took me around 2 or 3 novels. But then again, it was interesting to see, as Deborah describes, that a lot of writers kept themselves distant from political issues and social issues. I mean, these issues are so tense. They say that you have 2 Jews and three opinions, but when it comes to political conflicts, you can have 1 Jew with 2 opinions. So you don't want to write about it. You feel like you're putting yourself into a big mess, and that you are potentially harming your chances of being widely read across the country and being translated and etc. So So we do see a movement in Israeli literature in recent years to a more personal themes, family themes, a lot of memoirs, a lot of three-generation kind of fiction, something like that.
Yeah. And do you feel that a lot of Israeli writers are also speaking from a Jewish perspective? Are Israeli writers inherently Jewish writers as well, or does that just depend on the author?
That's a great question. Actually, I always saw myself as an Israeli writer, and even the subject of my first novel and my second novel were extremely Israeli, the political, social. But as I'm evolving as a writer, I find myself more and more attracted to my Jewish roots, and because when we came to, if you look at Jewish writers before the Israeli state was founded, and even Jewish writers who write today but not in Israel, you see that they deal a lot with questions of identity. Where do we belong to? What are the limits? When you read The Slave of Bashevi Zinger, a love story between a Jew and a Christian, and when you read even Agnon and Berdichevsky, so you see a lot of interest is put into questions of identity and limits. But when we already, when we have a state, so we are the main political powers, so like the identity is basically ours. So questions of identity were put aside, and now we were more of a political, social, moral questions, questions like, what makes us a society? The Jew that came from Morocco and the one who came from Poland, and the Arabs that also exist in our country, and we have 20% citizens who are Arab. So what makes us a society? And I think that literature in the 80s, 90s, and maybe at the beginning of 2000 went their big time until everyone was fed up with it, and now it's more. And I think more and more writers are writing about Jewish themes and subjects right now. I just told my wife a week ago that I can imagine myself living in another country, pretty cool, but I cannot imagine myself not being Jewish. And I'm completely secular. I'm not an Orthodox, and I'm not, I don't do anything on Shabbat. But I find myself more and more attracted to the Jewish culture, to the Jewish texts. So yeah, I think that for me at least, it's one of my revelations as growing up in my writing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you find inspiration from Jewish writers in the U.S. or in other countries as well?
Oh yeah. I'm a huge fan of Jewish writing. First of all, in the 19th century, the Yiddish writers were, for me, the biggest Jewish writers of all time. And what I try to do, even in The Slaughterman's Daughter, is to bring something that I always say that was forgotten when Jewish people lived in Poland and Russia. They came to Israel, but they forgot the humor, the Yiddish humor. They forgot it in Poland and Russia. Interesting enough, it didn't happen for Jewish Americans. When you read books like Gary Steingart and Jonathan Safran Foer and Michael Chabon and Bashevi Zinger, and there's a lot of humor in the writing, and in Israel, at least until, maybe Deborah correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know, it was extremely missing in our...
Meir Shalev was the first funny writer.
Yeah, I agree.
For me. Meir Shalev was funny.
Yeah.
The way he described a scene, he was the first person who I read in this country, in Hebrew, who was funny.
Yeah.
And it was the old-fashioned Jewish humor.
Right. Right.
And what year was that?
Early 80s. Very early 80s.
Up till now.
And now there are writers who use the humor.
Yeah.
We represent a writer named Yonatan Sageev, who we have not yet sold in America. We've sold him in Europe. And he has a very gay detective. And his books are funny. In a wonderfully original way. But humor is, you would think Israel would be the source.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Edgar Carrot is fantastic. But humor is really missing in the way you would expect it to be present, and it's not.
Why do you think that is? Is there a reason for that? Because when you think of Jewish humor, it's such an important part of our culture.
Yaniv?
I have an explanation. My only explanation for that is the Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish was a language that was a kind of a secret language between Jewish people to help them cope with the world. Jewish people knew that they cannot change their reality. They cannot, they have no political power. They have to be very careful of what they do and say. And the Yiddish language protected them with humor from everything that happened. It was, Bashevi Zinger says that Yiddish is not a victorious language. You cannot storm to battle using Yiddish. You cannot say, no.
That'd be interesting.
You cannot do it. It doesn't work. Okay, you can storm in Arabic. You can storm in Hebrew. You can probably storm in English, but you cannot storm up a hill in Yiddish. And it was the language that kept us together, that made fun of everything. And when the political situation changed, presumably we didn't need it anymore, and the fact that we went to speak in another language, a biblical language, with 3,000 years of tradition, every word carries an immense cargo of meanings. Every word we use in Hebrew has like 70 appearances in the Bible, and some of them are contradictory. And if you put a word in a book, it might say a few things relating to the historical background it has. So Yiddish was forgotten, and with that, I think that we gave up a very important aspect of Jewish life, which I admire in American literature.
I also think that Israelis are really funny amongst themselves, but they don't think anybody else can get that humor. And if they're going to be on an international stage, they have to behave well. They can't bring that humor into the international stage. I think they feel responsible to be mature, serious, challenging, the layers of drama and seriousness. But I think that the humor is amongst the Israeli guys sitting at a bar together, and it is fantastic humor. But I don't think most writers had the courage to bring that to the literary page that might reach another language.
Would you say that the Israeli themes overall, humor and other topics that come up in Israeli literature, do they generally translate well to the international audiences? Do other countries understand, the types of topics that Israeli writers touch on?
Well, I think that Israeli literature, in its essence, is much more European than American. It's more layered, it's more complex. You have to work really hard to get to the treasure. You have to work for it. And then if you're willing to put in that time, then you will get to, you will get to the essence. American literature is some of it, not all of it. Jonathan Franzen, Anna will go. American literature is more entertainment, lighter, more plot-driven. Israeli literature is not plot-driven. It is historical, it is thematic, there are layers upon layers, but you have to work to get to the fruit. And American literature is not like that. It's more entertaining, but I think you're left with less at the end. Mm-hmm. Israeli literature, you end up with aha, that stays with you in a way that, especially recent American literature, American Jewish literature.
Yeah. Yaniv, people are very curious about your book, The Slaughterman's Daughters, and since we've mentioned it, maybe you can just give those in the audience who are fans of yours and those who have yet to read it a little taste of it. What drew you to write this book, and give people some sense of what it's about.
All right. So thank you everyone for your great comments. And well, The Slaughterman's Daughter is a book that follows a very unique woman by the name of Fanny Kaisman. And she sets out to a wild journey in the Wild East, the Russian Empire, in the end of the 19th century, in order to find her sister husband, Tzvi Meir. Tzvi Meir left her sister. He left her, as we call in Hebrew, aguna, which means a chained woman. And this term signifies that the woman stays alone without her husband. She cannot remarry. She cannot get a divorce. She just has to wait. And usually in extreme poverty. And back then, especially towards the end of the 19th century, which is, by the way, a very interesting period, because, the world opened for many Jewish people in Eastern Europe, and many of them went to the US. Some of them went to Palestine. Others went to, all kinds of universities in Eastern Europe. And if you would open a Jewish newspaper, let's say in 1894, and you'll go to the ad section, and you'll see many advertisements of shoes, of hotels, of banks. You would also see many advertisements of women calling for the help of their community to locate their wayward husbands who just fled and didn't leave any trail. So Fanny decides that enough is enough, and she's out to get Tzvi Meir back or get a divorce from him. And she sets out to this extremely dangerous journey that is dangerous, by the way, for anyone, let alone a Jewish woman. But as I said, she's a unique character because she grew up as the daughter of the ritual slaughterer of Grodno. And as a child, she was attracted to his trade, and she learned how to use the knife. And since her childhood, she was actually waiting for a chance to go out and do whatever she is best doing, which is slit throats. And the thing is that does it in a kosher way. She slit throats in a kosher way. So this is basically the story. It's a crazy story. It's full of humor and details and many characters from the outskirts of Jewish society back then. And a lot of people ask me, how come you write about this period? What made you go back to the 19th century? And I think that it is very much related to our conversation because, you know, growing up in Israel, you, for example, as a school kid, you learn a lot about the biblical period, and you learn a lot about the foundation of the state of Israel. Obviously the Holocaust, but 2,500 years between the biblical period and the foundation of the state of Israel are not widely discussed. We don't really know what kind of life did your grandparents had in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Russia. I mean, you assume that they were prosecuted because, you know, this is what you learn, but you don't really know, you know, the basic details of the day-to-day lives. So I was really intrigued because in Israel, when you pick up a photo album from 1925 and you see your grandmother and you ask, okay, so who is she? Where did she live? What did she do? Nobody can answer these questions. So I really felt that this historical gap also creates an emotional gap among Israelis. If we don't really know our near history and we are only concerned with, you know, the biblical period and obviously the dreadful events of the Holocaust, then we miss a great parts of our culture. And as I went and did more research, I realized what a fantastic, intriguing and interesting world you know, my grandparents lived in. It was an enormous, interesting culture with all kinds of rituals. You know, we imagined them, you know, just Jewish Orthodox, but they were as everywhere with Jews, you know, all kinds of shades and opinions and cults and crazy stories. For example, the story which I tell in my book about the fact that Jewish kids were kidnapped from their beds to serve in the Russian army. This is something that we don't even learn in Israel. So I really felt that I want to bring 19th century Yiddish culture to the state of Israel, but not do it in an old-fashioned way because obviously it won't work, but kind of melt it with you know, modern literature, with themes that I like from television, with humor, and try to do something else with the ancient voice of Shalom Aleichem and the recent voices that I like in literature. So this is basically the story.
So are you a rare Israeli humorist or?
You know what? For me, it's almost an ideology to put, because humor is not only for, you know, you have a break of humor. It's a perspective. It's a worldview. You know, how do you treat life? How do you cope with life? So for me, I always try to make humor an important element in my writing. And if something is not happening, that I immediately sense that it's wrong, that I have to pick another direction. I mean, you don't have to laugh all the time, but yeah, from time to time, you have to break the tension and, you know, spice it with a bit of humor. It never killed anyone.
That's true. And what are you working on next? Are you already working on your next novel, or are you taking a break?
Well, I just published a book in Israel, No One Leaves Palo Alto, which is now being translated and hopefully will sell as well abroad. And this book, just to give you the premise, is it starts with an extra body that is being found in an anatomy lab. I mean, this lab has regularly 24 bodies in it, but one day the students come, the medicine student come to the lab, and instead of 24 bodies, there are 25 bodies. And now nobody knows where did this extra body came from, and it starts from like a detective story, but it opens into a real family kind of, I hope, interesting plots involving Haifa. I went to Haifa this time, which I believe is a very important city in Israel because it really signifies, Jews and Arabs and all kinds of cultures living together. And I don't know if you know, but recently it's been very hard to maintain this quiet life in many cities in Israel. So I think that not knowing the book is very relevant to what happened just recently in Israel. And it might seem as if I'm contradicting myself, but my next book revolves around the Holocaust. But since I really feel that everything was written about the Holocaust from every perspective, then I really try to do it differently. And I really try to write a book about the Holocaust without even mentioning even one scene from the Holocaust. So it's a very challenging experience, but I hope I can pull it out.
Batya Kaplan, I see in the chat, is mentioning Palo Alto and is curious about how to get that book. And other people are asking where to find you, how to hear about your books, where to buy them. I got my copy on Amazon. It's available.
Cool.
Good. And Deborah, maybe you can just talk a little bit about your relationship with Yaniv, because it seems that you two have a very close professional relationship. I don't know if that's common with most authors in Israel and literary agents, or the relationship between literary agents and authors in other countries. But you recently received the Jewish Book Council's Mentorship Award. So obviously you're doing something right with the authors that you represent. Can you speak a little bit about what your working relationship is with one another?
My relationship with Yaniv is a dream. It's what I want with a writer that I work with. It's to know that we're beginning on a journey that it's 1 book, 2 books, 3 books, 4 books, and then in its film and its television and its theater, and we're in it together. And I think what happened at a certain point, being an agent, that there were people when they called, I really didn't want to talk to them. And there were people that I really cherished each call. And then you do, you kind of clean things out. And then you work with the people that you have a very, very close relationship with. And maybe it's a privilege that other agents don't have, but I can allow myself at this point where I work with about 30 or 40 clients, and I'm closest with Yaniv. But no, I'm really close with, they're my family. That's what I do all day, and it's what I want to do all day. And it's about building something really big and meaningful together. Mm-hmm. And Yaniv and I've met Yaniv's parents. When Yaniv's book comes out in Romania, which is next year, we're all going. My husband, George Altman, and me and Yaniv and his parents, we're going on a trip together. It's family.
Yeah.
And that's really how it brings the greatest joy and depth to my work. And I have not a lot, but many clients that this is what it's like. Mm-hmm. And this is how I want to work. If it's not like this, I'm not interested in investing my time. It is so much work. I love my work, but I want to do it with people who I treasure and whose work I think is really important and lasting.
Mm-hmm. And do you tend to seek out authors at this point in your career? Are you looking for certain types of authors to represent in the future?
I am not looking for new writers, but when an opportunity of a brilliant book comes along, of course I jump in, and I tend to put my entire life into the process.
Mhm.
And then it's put into a process, and then I'm not needed for a year because it's in translation and it's on its way. And then I'll step back in when I'm needed again. But I would hate to think that I would miss a really important Israeli novel, fiction, literature, or nonfiction that I could really build. I wouldn't want to miss that, but I'm not looking for new clients at this point. And yet, there's always another one that I really fall in love with. And it happened a month or two ago. There's a novel called Ech Lahovit Bitech, How to Love Your Daughter, written by Hila Bloom, and who's a literary editor in Israel. She is the editor of Eshkol Nevo, of Atkar Keret. She's in this book. I just fell in love with it. And now we're up to 15 languages. And there's nothing more thrilling for me than to find an Israeli book that can reach an audience, an international audience. And I think that working with David Grossman from his first book gave me that courage and the experience to know what it's like to find an Israeli novel, real literature that can go to 10, 20, 30 languages and build an international audience of readers. So, and there's nothing more thrilling for me than that.
We have someone in our audience, Denisa, who's in Romania, who says she's very excited for you to come. And and welcome.
It's a family trip. We'll all be there together.
She's waiting for you. She's waiting. That's wonderful. And are there any other authors that our audience should look out for that are emerging from the Israeli market right now that they should be looking for, reading, purchasing? Anyone that we may not have heard of yet?
I do have a writer who's coming out in August. His name is Ido Geffen. The book is called Jerusalem Beach. It's a collection of short stories that are very, very exceptional. They are set in reality, but they take reality and stretch it a bit. And he's young. He is a neuropsychologist. No, he's a Yaniv. What is he? A neuro something.
He's the sweetest person on earth. Seriously.
He is the sweetest person on earth, but he deserves to have his title.
Nobody understands what he does.
He's on another planet too, but his book, Jerusalem Beach, is coming out, and it's coming out in many languages, and we'll see. He's very young, and he's extremely promising. And when he and Yaniv met, it was really, it was very joyful for me.
Wonderful. Yaniv, there's one of our audience members is asking a little bit about your process. Where these really interesting ideas come for your work and how you do your research. I know that you have a PhD. How do you do the research? How long does it take you to come up with your writing?
Actually, the basic idea of the book, the basic premise, I just get it from, I don't know, it just happens. I mean, for example, the Slaughterman's daughter, my mother sent me an archive of Yiddish newspaper or Hebrew newspaper from the 19th century, and since I adore this period, as I told, as I said, so I just started to read newspapers, Hebrew newspapers, and then I came into this advertisement page, and I saw this ad, and I immediately knew that I'm going to write this book about Fanny Kaisman. So it just happened. I think that my process involves more in understanding why did I have this strong intuition. I mean, unlike other writers that I sometimes talk with, they know what they want to write about and they know why. For me, at least in the beginning, it starts with just a story that I want to tell. I don't even know why I want to tell it, but it's like in Palo Alto, I was interested in anatomy. I had a friend who just went to med school, and he told me about this great anatomy course, and I told him, I have to learn it. I have to learn it. So he took me to the lab, and I started dissecting bodies in the anatomy lab because it was extremely interesting. And then someone told me that just a year before that, one of the bodies was Yoram Kenyuk body, one of my favorite writers in Israel. Yoram Kenyuk dedicated his body to science. So immediately I thought to myself, if I would come here just 1 year ago, I might have dissect Yoram Kenyuk's body. So this is where Palo Alto came. I thought about a student, a med student, that goes to the first lesson and he needs to dissect the body, and he suddenly realizes that he knows the man that he's dissecting. So I just get these stories. They just come to me, and I think that most of my work, most of my process, why I do a lot of research. And it seems like as if I'm reading a lot of books, about the subjects, but basically what I'm looking for is my own private intuition and interest of why was I so amazed? Why was I struck by this story to begin with? So when I write the book, it's like I'm conducting a personal investigation in myself, trying to figure out why Fanny Kaisman is so interesting in my view. What do I find in her, and what do we have in common? I mean, me and my protagonist. So basically, only at the end of the book, I think that I realize what made this story so appealing for me.
It's very interesting. And we have so many questions coming in from the audience. I have many more questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. This hour has flown by. But maybe if we could just close with one final question that's come up is, just overall, how would you categorize the future of Israeli literature? What do you predict coming up on the market? What should American and other viewers who are watching with us today be on the lookout for? Will Israeli humor come back? Will politics come back? Will there be a whole new genre coming up in the future? Maybe
go first.
Either way. go for it.
One of my biggest fears, and it includes Yaniv, is that because Israeli television is so successful, that there will be a brain drain and Israeli writers will migrate to television. And even though I really think I get it and I support it and I'm working in that field and I want that to happen, I don't want it to happen at the expense of Israeli literature. It's so much easier when you make it into television to make money, to be recognized. But I don't want my writers to be the ones to move there and not come back. If it's a per project, but don't give up Israeli literature. People here have lives that are so interesting and experiences that are not comparable to anybody else's. They're unique, they're Israeli, with everything that everyone has brought from their past. I have no doubt that Israeli literature will continue to flourish. There will be stars, and there are always gifted people. But we're living at a time where it's getting harder and harder to break through, politically and culturally and socially. And it comes back to why I'm so grateful for this program today. There are times where we can really feel alone and think that, who cares about us? And now I know that all of you out there really do care, or else you wouldn't be here. So I know that that talent will sustain itself and will be there, but we can't do it alone. And that's what's important for me, is I know, God willing, I'll continue finding those voices. And I have screwed up, and I've missed writers, and I've probably not sold the ones that I should have sold. But I can't do it without the people in America and organizations like yours that are helping us and giving us this platform to reach out.
Thank you. We're happy to support you, and all of us love Israeli literature, and we have even people in the chat asking you to come to their cities on your next book tour. So people certainly are huge fans, and I don't personally, I'm a big fan of Israeli television, but I hope it won't replace literature. People need to read as well. Yaniv, any final thoughts from you as well?
First of all, it is a great opportunity to thank you. I mean, IFL and the Jewish Book Council for doing this, because as Deborah said, it means the world to us. And it's so hard to be an Israeli writer to the extent that if you're not being translated, you have to get a day job, and then the quality of writing is not as it could be. So really, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being here and hosting us. And today is a very special day in Israel. We have a new government, so we are all a bit confused, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I do think that Israeli society is one, perhaps. Well, I don't know how many examples do you have of such a society which has so many problems, and which is located in a very problematic place. And at the end of the day, with all due respect to romantic books and thrillers and family books, people also want to dwell on serious thoughts, which cannot be expressed in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy, but I realized that the correct platform for me is literature, that we have to go through an emotional process. First and foremost, the emotional process has to be underneath any change or any mode of thought. So I do think that Israeli literature will last, and I do feel that there are many young and interesting voices. As Deborah said, I also feel that a lot of women writers are coming ahead and become more and more central and dominant, which I basically admire and support. And I think that the future it will be very, very interesting in terms of Israeli fiction.
Well, I like the optimism, and can't wait to read your next book. Can't wait to follow, Deborah, your career as it continues to flourish, and see which authors you represent next. For everyone in our audience, thank you so much for watching in Israel, in the US, and around the world. A lot of people are asking how to access this webinar and to share it with others. You can email us anytime at webinar@aifl.org for a copy of this webinar. It will also be posted afterwards in the next day or two on our website, as well as on YouTube. All of our 100+ webinars that we've shown are on YouTube and available for you. Thank you so much to Deborah, to Yaniv, to Jane Weitzman, to the Jewish Book Council. to all of you for joining me today. I certainly have a lot more summer reading that I have to do now. And we look forward to having you join us on our next webinar. Our webinars are every Wednesday and Sunday at noon Eastern. This will be the Ambassadors Forum, a diplomatic review, another very fascinating discussion between 3 career diplomats whose careers span over 3 decades coming from Israel. So thank you again to all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday and happy reading to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.